As it turns out, components don't necessarily have to be classes. There's another kind of component called a stateless functional component that you can use under certain circumstances. And in that case, your component is just a function. We've said before that components are like functions and props are like arguments that you pass in. Sometimes that's literally the case. You can make components that are just functions under certain circumstances. The main circumstance is right there in the name, stateless functional component. And that is if you don't need state inside that component. Props are still fine. But if that component doesn't have any data that it maintains itself, there's a pretty good chance you can make it a stateless functional component. So thinking for a moment about our data, what data do we have? We have the actual messages, right? We have the current user. We have the list of channels or rooms or whatever you want to call them. We have the name of the current room, that kind of stuff. So thinking about chat header here. Do we think it needs state of its own? So what information is there? The name of the current channel and some information about that channel. Is that data that it's going to manage itself, or is that going to be passed in by something else? How are we probably going to get there? By clicking something in the sidebar, right? So that data is probably going to be passed into chat header. Chat header probably doesn't need to manage that data itself. It doesn't need to change it. So we could make chat header, I suspect, a stateless functional component. So let's learn how to do that. I'll leave the class component there for a moment until we write the new version. So a stateless functional component is just a function. So I will say const chat header equals arrow function. And then we don't need a render method because the whole component is the render method. Since the entire component is just a function, that function just needs to return some JSX, and it's a component. So I can pretty much just take this return statement right here, stick that in there, and that should be it. I no longer need to import component because we're not extending it anymore, but I do still need to import React. React needs to be there or the JSX isn't going to work. So we just import from React, and we create a function that returns some JSX, and that is a totally valid and simpler component. It's simpler for a variety of reasons. One, it's just a function. It's not a class. It doesn't have methods. It's just a single function itself. And since it doesn't inherit from another class, there's a bunch of stuff that isn't there. There's a bunch of methods and things that we don't need. So it's just very simple. So we're going to do that whenever we can. And this seems like a reasonable opportunity to do so. Refresh. Hang on. What? I think I did. Why it doesn't have state? Right. Yeah, I did. Did you all catch that? We're able to do this because this component doesn't have state that it needs to manage itself. Now, none of our components have state yet, but as we discussed a moment ago, some of them we know are going to, right? We're going to have some data, but it doesn't seem like the header here has its own data that it needs to manage. All the data it displays is probably going to come from somewhere else because it's going to get loaded when we click this, right? And all it knows is the name of the channel and a description of the channel. So it seems like it doesn't need to manage its own state, so we can make it a stateless functional component. Use a stateless functional component for chat header. And we're going to be using a lot of those from now on. And there'll be links in today's notes with more information about that, about some of the advantages of using them, etc.